When you think of vampires, what comes to mind? Although your answer will definitely show your age, it's pretty remarkable to think about how many iterations of the blood-sucking monster there are in pop culture. Whether you go to the techno-loving ravers in Blade, the sexy J.Crew models of the Pacific Northwest of the Twilight series, the rebellious rock stars in The Lost Boys, or most recently, the socially inept, energy-draining a-holes in What We Do in the Shadows. It's safe to say there's an enduring fascination with the Count. But why? Maybe it's because of what they represent: immortality and supernatural power. For us mortals, there's an alluring desire for escape, control, and yes, even romantic fascination. After all, 50 Shades of Grey was based on Twilight fanfiction. Often represented as social outcasts, it's easy for people to relate. Everyone has felt like an outsider at some point, and these stories often seem to tap into that in some way. For Anne Rice, the acclaimed gothic fiction author best known for writing the Vampire Chronicles, the death of her daughter from leukemia deeply influenced the first book in the series, Interview with the Vampire. The book was a meditation on loss and mortality, and for Rice, ultimately, a way to process grief. However, despite the seemingly endless variations of vampires throughout the years, all of them can be traced back to a single source. In 1897, Irish novelist Bram Stoker published his gothic horror novel, Dracula. Its main character, Count Dracula, is considered the OG, the prototypical and archetypal vampire, and was one of the best-known fictional figures not only of the Victorian era, but throughout the decades, staying every bit as relevant today. I mean, you need look no further than your local Spirit Halloween. But you may be surprised to learn that the character of Dracula was not entirely a work of fiction. There was, in fact, a very real source of historical inspiration behind the bloodthirsty man-bat. But to find him, we have to go all the way back to the mid-1400s during a brutal time of intense bloodshed between Christians and the Ottoman Empire. Here, there was a man stuck between the two forces, desperately trying to defend his home. His name was Vlad III, also known as Vlad the Impaler, also known as Vlad Dracula. Hello everybody, today we're going to be talking about Vlad the Impaler, the man for which Dracula was inspired. To keep the spooky season rolling, today we're talking about the inspirations for one of the most iconic horror characters of all time, and how terrors in real life inspired those in fiction. Some of the stuff the real Dracula did puts the fake one to shame, so I'm excited to talk about it. So if that sounds interesting to you, then stick around after the ad as we talk about the true story of Count Dracula. While talking about someone that disassembled a lot of bodies, let's talk about something that keeps your body together, like today's sponsor, AG1. AG1 Next Gen is the daily health drink clinically shown to support gut health and fill in common nutrient gaps. AG1 Next Gen replaces the need for your probiotics, your multivitamins, and more. That's because it has 5 probiotic strains and over 75 vitamins and minerals. So instead of a bunch of pills and doses you have to take every day, it's instead one easy drink. So all you need is 8 to 12 ounces of cold water and a spoonful of AG1 and you're good to go. AG1's backed by multiple clinical trials, but I can tell you from my own experience that it just helps me feel better. I used to be really bad about taking naps midway through the day or getting tired after lunch. And it turns out I just didn't feel as well when I wasn't putting the things into my body that my body needed. So it's not like AG1's some stimulant or miracle drug, it's just the things that you're probably missing out on. And AG1's always been a pleasant way to start your morning, but now there's even more ways to do it. That's because in addition to their original flavor, they now have berry, citrus, and tropical. So you can get the best start to your day the way you want it. And if you're looking to get in on AG1, then now's the perfect time. Because if you head to the link in the description at drinkag1.com/Wendigang or scan the QR code along with your order of AG1, you'll get a free welcome kit. That is right, a free welcome kit that contains things like a bottle of vitamin D3 and K2, free AG1 and their convenient travel packs, a metal canister, a shaker bottle. Again, all that for free when you get AG1 at the link in the description or scan the QR code to get in on this incredible offer today. Thank you all for watching the ad. Thank you to AG1 for sponsoring the channel. Their link will be in the description. We are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. Vlad III, Vlad Dracula, or his most dubious name, Vlad the Impaler, certainly bears with it a lot of horror-inducing bravado. But behind the moniker was a complex figure who truly embodied the duality of horror and heroism. It all depends on who you ask. Put another way, Vlad was known to be a terrifying, violent monster, but he was also revered as a hero and a symbol of national independence. Before the gruesome punishments and his notoriously harsh brand of justice laid out upon the targets of his disapproval, Vlad the Impaler, who we will simply refer to as Dracula, began like all great and terrible men do, as a young boy. Dracula was born in 1431 to the noble house of the Draculesti, true to his fictional counterpart in the Transylvanian town of Sighiswara. For historical context, 1431 was the same year that Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in France, so such were the times. Dracula's father, Vlad II, was surnamed Dracula after his induction into the chivalric Order of the Dragon. Founded in 1408 to follow in the steps of the Crusades, the Order of the Dragon consisted of high aristocracy and monarchs sworn to defend the cross and fight the enemies of Christianity, specifically the Ottoman Empire. Vlad II took his surname from this order, which was also known as Ordinului de Dracula. The name Dracula, which meant dragon in Old Romanian and devil in the common tongue, was passed down to Vlad Dracula, which literally meant son of Dracula. So in other words, son of the devil or son of the dragon. Dracula was born the middle son of his father, Vlad II, with one older brother, Mircea, and a younger brother, Radu. There are theories, but it is unsure exactly who Dracula's mother was. What we do know is that he was raised during a time in which the world consisted of shifting allegiances and violent struggles between Christian kingdoms and the Muslim Ottoman Empire. In the middle of this conflict was Walachia, a region that became a core part of what is known today as Romania. For context, Transylvania is a historical province within Romania, just like Walachia and Moldavia. In the 15th century, Walachia was a vulnerable buffer state, quote, a zone of Christian Europe under continual threat of Ottoman invasion, according to History Extra, after the fall of Constantinople. Vlad II had a claim to the Wallachian throne due to being an illegitimate son of Mircea the Elder, who ruled the region until his death in 1418. However, as a youth, Vlad II spent his time not in Wallachia, but as a hostage in the court of Sigismund of Luxembourg. Sigismund of Luxembourg was the king of Hungary. And over the years, Vlad II would not abandon his claim to the throne, but he would have to wait as his half-brother, Alexander I of Aldea, reigned over the region with the support of the Ottoman Sultan, Murad II. All this means that it wouldn't be until 1436, after Alexander's death, that Vlad II would seize Wallachia with Hungarian support. With Sigismund in his corner, Vlad II successfully claimed the throne, despite the political landscape favoring the Ottoman Empire, which at the time was expanding into the Balkans. Vlad II, now at the helm, found himself entangled in Wallachia's treacherous politics. Only 1 year after taking power, Sigismund died in 1437, and Hungary's position was severely weakened. As a result, Vlad had no other choice but to change sides and pay homage to Murad. When Murad wanted to invade Hungary, Vlad supported the military campaign and served as his guide, ignoring Sigismund's successor, who wrote to Vlad ordering him to protect Transylvania, which had been under Hungary's rule for centuries. The invasion occurred in the summer of 1438. The 45-day raid, personally led by Murad, was met with little organized resistance, and they devastated southeastern Hungary by burning villages and causing widespread destruction. It wasn't until the siege of Zabin, which is modern-day Sibiu, that citizens put up a real defense against the Ottomans, slowing their advance and causing significant casualties. This raid had lasting effects as part of the Ottoman strategy to expand into Hungary, and underscored Transylvania's vulnerability. Essentially, it highlighted the need for united defense against the Ottoman threat. A few years later, in 1441, the highest-ranked official of Transylvania, an important figure in the story named John Hunyadi, came to Wallachia to persuade Vlad to join their crusade against the Ottomans. In 1441, Hunyadi defeated the Ottoman army in Transylvania, and 1 year later, Murad summoned Vlad for an apparent diplomatic council. Vlad agreed and brought his young sons, Dracula, aged 11, and Radu, aged 7. As soon as they reached the gates, Vlad was, quote, seized by a Turkish contingent and bound in chains. His two young sons were taken away to a distant mountain fortress. Meanwhile, back in Wallachia, Hunyadi invaded the region and put Vlad's cousin, Basarab II, in charge. Vlad would eventually be released before the end of the following year, but was forced to leave Dracula and Radu as hostages to guarantee Vlad's loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. It was during this time as a political prisoner that Dracula would form the basis for his brutal and cruel methods of punishment, which he would later go on to employ as an adult. Or as mental health professionals and other people who know what they're talking about would probably call it trauma. What happened to Dracula and his younger brother sadly wasn't uncommon during this period. In fact, young Christian boys would be forcibly recruited from their families and communities to serve in the Ottoman army as janissaries. which were members of their elite infantry in one of Europe's first standing armies. This act, called the Devshirme, also referred to as the blood tax, involved Ottoman officials collecting Christian boys, typically aged 7 to 20, from Balkan and Anatolian villages. If you remember the Lord's Resistance Army's recruiting methods from the Coney 2012 video, this may sound familiar. Young boys taken from their homes, required to convert to Islam and cut ties with their families. To quote one historian, quote, "This was considered one of the most devilish and perhaps unique methods of world conquest among all those yet devised by humankind." The purpose of this blood tax was to counterbalance the Turkish nobles who sometimes opposed the Sultan and his policies. By creating his own class of soldiers with no ties to the established Turkish nobles, the Sultan received total loyalty. The system was also beneficial off the battlefield, as these boys could grow into prominent imperial administrators to the Sultan. Dracula, however, would end up neither a soldier nor an official under the Sultan. That's because from 1442 to 1448, Dracula remained a captive under the Ottoman court. Based on historical accounts, both of the Wallachian princes were treated relatively well by their captors. They received education in science, philosophy, and warfare, and it was during this time that Dracula developed proficiency at riding and combat. Most notably, Dracula observed how the Turks used terror as a weapon. Despite the relatively decent treatment, Dracula held an enduring bitterness towards the Ottomans because, they kidnapped him. He did not speak the language of his jailers, and their religion was completely foreign to him. And it's from here that the two brothers' fates would diverge. Dracula's brother Radu grew close to the Ottomans, even earning the nickname Radu the Fair, unlike his brother Dracula, who held contempt for his captors, nursing a desire for vengeance that motivated him to fight the Turks later in life. Radu would eventually serve as an Ottoman-installed ruler of Wallachia. Dracula, however, returned home in 1448 with hatred for the men who held him hostage. Dracula did not return to the same home he had left 6 years earlier. In his absence, Walachia was plunged into chaos. His father, Vlad II, who had been the region's prince since 1436, found that his rule had suddenly become precarious amid shifting alliances. In 1444, nearly halfway through Dracula and Radu's imprisonment, Vlad's eldest son, Mircea, was allowed to cooperate with Christian forces. This act meant that Vlad had broken his promise to the Sultan and, consequently, risked the lives of Dracula and Radu. Because of this, both sons received harsher treatment during their imprisonment as a result. So because their brother decided to fight with the Ottomans' enemy, they got harsher treatment in Ottoman jail. In 1447, Vlad II, Dracula's father, was overthrown and killed, reportedly hunted down and murdered in a swamp on the order of Hunyadi. And Dracula's oldest brother, Mircea, was tortured before being buried alive by conspirators supporting the Transylvanian official. And as a result, one of Hunyadi's puppets, Vladislav II, was left in charge of the region. When news of his father's death reached Dracula, it meant he was now completely free. The Ottomans had him prisoner to keep his father in line, and now his father's not around. So the young hostages were released by the Turks, and Dracula was even given an office position in the Turkish army. Dracula publicly took the Turk support, but this was a strategic move as Dracula waited for his first favorable political circumstance in which he could reclaim the Wallachian throne. So to recap, Dracula's father ruled over Wallachia, a region that was wanted by both the Ottoman Muslims and the Christian armies. Dracula and his brother were taken prisoner to use as leverage against their father, and eventually his father was killed, his older brother was killed, and now his father's land was being ruled by an underling of the man that killed them. So now, Dracula, who would later get the nickname of the Impaler, is going back home. So you can imagine what he does. It did not take long for him to get his opportunity. In 1448, Dracula saw and recognized his chance to take back his father's seat. That autumn, Hunyadi and Vladislav II were away from Wallachia campaigning against the Ottomans. Dracula pounced on this opportunity and successfully invaded Wallachia with his support from the Ottomans. Keep in mind, Dracula isn't a fan of either side. The Ottomans kept him prisoner for years, and the Christians are the ones that killed his father. But since the Ottomans are the one that offered him an army, they're useful for now. So with support from the Ottomans, Dracula was able to capture the capital and briefly install himself as prince, asserting his claim as Vlad II's heir. Unfortunately for Dracula, his first taste of power was quick. Hunyadi's forces returned only 2 months later, and Vladislav II drove Dracula out, forcing the young usurper to flee towards the north. And right after that, the Hungarian forces assumed power back over Wallachia. So from 1448 to 1455, Dracula lived in exile for 7 years. While little's recorded during this period, it was clear that his fortune shifted with the geopolitical winds. At first, Dracula sided with the Ottomans, but he soon changed sides in the broader Turco-Hungarian conflict, as he felt this would give him the best advantage to retake Wallachia. And by the mid-1450s, circumstances were tilted in Dracula's favor. Just 2 years earlier, in 1453, the fall of Constantinople signaled a major threat to the Christian realms. Marking the end of the Roman Empire by installing a new Islamic capital, Ottoman power spread throughout Europe. Most immediately affected were Wallachia, Transylvania, and Hungary, as news about the horror and suffering that coincided with the fall of Constantinople reached these regions first. Refugees shared stories of how some who were captured by the Turks, quote, were impaled by order of the Sultan on stakes planted in full view of the beleaguered city. Dracula had almost certainly heard some of these stories and felt inspired. In 1456, Dracula led a force of exiled Wallachian fighters, mercenaries, and Hungarian allies across the Danube into his homeland to reclaim Wallachia. The region was left vulnerable as Hunyadi and his army battled against a campaign led by Sultan Mehmed II outside the region. Everyone in this story is named the second. Like, we don't get to hear about any of the first guys that showed up, just the second ones. Dracula targeted Vladislav II, see? Told you. The man who had driven Dracula's father out. Both men faced off in battle, and Dracula slayed Vladislav II in hand-to-hand combat, which had to be a satisfying moment for Dracula. Think about it. He was in his father's empire, and then the Hungarians had him for a while, and then the Ottomans had him for a while, and then the Hungarian forces killed his father and took his land, and now he's back in the land his father used to rule, and he killed the guy who was sitting on his father's throne in hand-to-hand combat. Rumors spread that Dracula had physically ripped Vladislav's head off. And while these claims are not historically supported, it does reflect the beginning of Dracula's fearsome reputation. And most importantly, it's cool, so I choose to believe it. Either way, in that moment, Dracula avenged his father's betrayal and removed his own chief rival. And Hunyadi, or anyone else who would oppose him, was too busy fighting the Ottomans to do anything about it. The triumphant 25-year-old became the Prince of Wallachia once again. And this time, he would rule the throne over a bloody 6-year reign that would earn him eternal infamy. Dracula's second time at the helm began with him inheriting a Wallachia in disarray. The region's nobility and feudal lords had grown accustomed to backstabbing and shifting alliances, which, as you can imagine, contributed to the aforementioned instability. Princes reigned for only an average of 2 years. The agreed upon arrangement had been that power would be shared between the princes and the noble class. Prior to Dracula's second reign, the noblemen had begun to assert themselves upon the authority of the prince. This time, however, Dracula wasn't playing around and did not allow for collective leadership. The young prince was, quote, determined to crush the power of the nobility, centralize the administration of the state, and create a military force loyal only to himself. Remembering his time as a captive under the Ottomans and having learned from their methods, Dracula understood that to secure his rule, he needed to remove dissent and intimidate any potential traitors amongst the nobles. So he began centralizing power through sheer terror, which would earn him his nickname of Vlad the Impaler that we all know and love. Love may be a strong word, but hey, remember Twilight? Funny vampires in the woods and stuff. Yeah, this is what started that. So, you know, we love that, I guess. And also, up until this point in the story, it's hard not to side with Dracula, right? His father ruled a province that took neither side in the conflict, and because it, both sides attacked and killed him. And then he goes back and in hand-to-hand combat defeats the person that killed his father and his brother. And now he's sitting back on the throne, once again not involved with either side of the conflict. And he managed to play the two sides against each other as it benefited him. It all seems cool and knowable up until this point, right? Well, now that he's in charge, he's going to make sure he stays in charge. And once again, that's where the Impaler mantra comes from. And he becomes immediately less easy to root for. As one Romanian chronicle tells it, Dracula invited all of the nobles of Wallachia to a grand banquet at his palace in Targovista. Once the Easter feast was finished, Dracula turned on his guests, accusing them of treachery and ordering his guards to seize the entire party, all 200 nobles and their wives. What followed was ghastly. Quote, the old elites and their wives were impaled beyond the city walls. The young and able-bodied were manacled and chained to each other and then marched northward. This march was on a 50-mile trek to the site that would later become Castle Dracula. The imprisoned were turned into a, quote, vast army of slaves, toiling, seeding, building the present castle. And this would mark the beginning, fittingly, of Dracula's reign of terror. The purge had a twofold effect. It eliminated many of the old power brokers who might have challenged Dracula, and it served as a stark warning to the surviving nobility and populace. Impalement, a truly agonizing form of execution in which victims were pierced through the torso with a wooden stake and left to slowly die, became Dracula's preferred punishment for any offense or disloyalty. Since it's just a sharpened stick that your body weight's placed on top of, so you have to agonizingly feel it slowly work its way up through your torso until you bleed out. Also, wooden stakes, huh? That sounds like Dracula, right? Stake through the heart, you see where it's coming. Through his brutal impalings, Dracula showed the world that no one was beyond his wrath. Now left with many sudden vacancies, Dracula instated positions of authority with new men who would be loyal to him. These men often came from lower status, which restructured Walachia's social order. And similar to the Sultan's strategy with the Devshirme, these newly elevated men, quote, owed their power entirely to the new prince and had a vested stake in the survival of the regime. It's kind of like when a new tech startup promotes the people who helped launch the company in the first place, instead of bringing in executive seats to fill out the roles. Except in this case, it's to make sure that none of your executives poison you or stab you to death in your sleep. Which maybe they have to worry about at tech startups, I don't know. In contrast to the disloyal noble class, the common folk of Wallachia as a whole looked favorably upon Dracula and rallied to his cause. They were tired of the nobility for a while and tired of the war, so it's nice to see a guy that doesn't want to be a part of the war who also put the noble people on poles. In return, Dracula fought for them. He defended them from the Turkish demands by refusing to pay the tribute in both money and resources like grain and horses. This tribute was installed during the reign of Vlad II, Dracula's father, who had to swear loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan. Dracula also opposed the Devshirme, preventing the Turks from enrolling Wallachian children into the Janissary Corps. So he's keeping the Ottomans from taxing them or taking their children. I'm sure they like that. The people would later fully support Dracula during his Turkish campaign in 1462. Dracula then set his sights on other groups he saw as threats to his authority. The Regent Saxons of Transylvania, for example, were German-speaking merchants who had undermined Wallachian trade. Dracula retaliated by launching raids into their markets, and from 1457 to 1458, he impaled dozens of Saxon merchants and officials after attacking Transylvanian towns. He plundered their goods and burned down entire villages that were places of refuge for his rivals. These actions sent shockwaves through the Transylvanian Saxon communities, who would later spread some of the most effective anti-Dracula propaganda in Europe. And coincidentally is where we get a lot of his reputational stuff today. 1 year later, in 1459, Dracula conducted one of his most devastating raids in Transylvania. As his soldiers indiscriminately captured as many people as possible, impaling them, Dracula was meanwhile, quote, seated at a table having his meal. He seemed to enjoy the gruesome scenario of his butchers cutting off the limbs of many of his victims, and even, quote, dipped his bread in the blood of the victims. Ah, you're that, drinking blood. So we got wooden stakes, and now we've got blood drinking, right? This is still fun. We're keeping it fun. This isn't just sad and depressing, right? It's fun. It's Dracula. Ah, I want to suck your blood. Haha, right? Okay. Not as fun when you think about like a ruling class doing it to peasants over trade disputes. The gruesome banquet would later be immortalized in a 15th century woodcut in Bucharest, Romania. In the artwork, Dracula is in a field, seated at a banquet table amongst hundreds of impaled victims, suffering, dying, and decaying around him while the severed heads and limbs of others lie at his feet. More of the ruler's brutality was evidenced by the social cleansing he conducted of his own land. Dracula invited, quote, the old, the ill, the lame, the poor, the blind, and the vagabonds of Wallachia to a lavish feast at his palace and fed them well with meat and drink. But as they fed, they suddenly found themselves, quote, faced with fire and smoke on all sides. The prince had ordered his servants to set the house on fire, the enfeebled guests trapped inside. As they rushed to the doors to escape, they discovered the doors had been locked. There was no way out. When the fires finally abated, there was, quote, no trace of any living soul. Which, good rule of thumb, don't go to dinner with Dracula. This is the third time now a lot of people have died when he was hungry. And this is where the sympathy or relatability for Dracula totally falls off, as if impaling peasants earlier didn't do that enough. This account vividly demonstrates the purifying that Dracula cruelly exercised to impose his vision of order. But perhaps the most telling illustration of his absolute power is a simple account with no bloodshed at all. Apparently, Dracula had an ornate cup made of gold placed near a fountain that was connected to a river. Travelers passing from all over the continent came to drink at this fountain, but so great was the fear of impalement that, quote, so long as he lived, no one dared to steal the cup, and it was left at its place. Think about that. He has such a reputation that he leaves a gold cup by the side of the river for people to drink from, but he is so feared that no one steals the cup. Another story often told about Dracula involves a group of Ottoman messengers coming to meet with the Wallachian prince. However, when the Ottoman messengers arrived, they refused to remove their turbans as it was their religious custom not to. Dracula commended them on their devotion and ensured that their turbans would forever remain on their heads, as he had them nailed to the Ottoman skulls. In Dracula's 6-year-long reign, it is estimated that he took no less than 40,000 lives, with some estimates as high as 100,000. A truly staggering number. Because keep in mind, these aren't 40 or 100,000 in a war he led. This is 40 or 100,000 deaths he saw to himself. That's anywhere from 18 to 45 victims a day. But more than sheer volume, it was Dracula's use of impalement that truly shocked the world. When you hear exactly how he did it, you begin to understand how he earned the nickname Vlad the Impaler. Here's a breakdown. Stakes stood permanently prepared in the palace's courtyard in strategic locations like public squares and in the vicinity of the capital. Dracula was often present at the time of these impalements, and the victim's legs were stretched apart by 2 horses, one attached to each leg, that were sent running in different directions, while attendants held the stake and body firmly in place. The stakes were usually rounded at the end and bathed in oil so that the victim's entrails would not be so quickly pierced by a fatal wound, allowing them to suffer longer as they died. Not all of the impalements were pierced from the buttocks up, although many were. And based on several prints, men, women, and even children were also impaled through the heart, the navel, the stomach, and the chest. Impalement may have been his preferred form of punishment, but it wasn't his only form, as Dracula also decapitated his victims, cut off noses, ears, sexual organs, and limbs. He blinded, strangled, hanged, burned, boiled skin, roasted, hacked, nailed, and had his victims buried alive. The last one being just like how his older brother died. He exposed them to the elements, to wild animals, and built secret trap doors to drop them on cunningly located stakes below. If he did not practice cannibalism, he at least compelled others to eat human flesh. He made use of the wheel, hot irons, and other forms of medieval torture. Turkish sources claim that, on one occasion, he smeared salt and honey on the soles of the captives' feet and allowed animals to lick them for indefinite periods of suffering. Which sounds kind of cute and like it would tickle until the animals keep licking and peel all of the skin off your feet. Which, how evil do you have to be to even come up with that? Hey, I bet an animal will lick honey and salt off of someone a lot. You want to see how long? With such bloody methods of torture readily available at his disposal, Dracula aggressively asserted centralized control. His use of terror in Walachia ended this period of feudal lords having unchecked power by putting the noble class under his domination. But as you could imagine, he also prevented crime brought on by thieves and vagrants, and ensured the security of his merchants and their goods at a time when roads were hazardous. You know, someone may want to steal some gold. Someone doesn't want to steal some gold if it means they're going to be fried, made to eat human flesh, have animals lick the skin off their feet, and then get buried alive or impaled. All the way to the end of Dracula's reign, the Wallachian peasants accepted that, despite or even because of these harsh methods, their rights were also being protected. According to historians Florescu and McNally, quote, as a result, Dracula is remembered most reverently by the Romanian people, which is easy to say when he's not putting you on a stake. With Wallachia now finally in order, Dracula set his sights outside of his homeland and towards the Ottoman Empire. During Dracula's time at the helm, a greater threat loomed: the Ottoman Empire, which was now under Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, who had renewed his push into Europe. Up to this point, Wallachian princes were expected to pay the Turks an annual tribute of gold and young boys as hostages to avoid invasion. Well, now, leading Wallachia's quest for independence, Dracula abruptly decided to stop paying the Sultan's tribute in 1459. This put a target on Dracula's back and sent him on a collision course with Mehmed the Conqueror. In the winter of 1461, Dracula made the first move. Launching a bold, preemptive campaign across the Danube, Dracula's forces raided Ottoman territory. Dracula's strategy was speed, bold action, and ruthlessness, forcing his troops to cover over 800 kilometers or nearly 500 miles in 2 weeks. They sacked villages and forts, killing thousands in a frenzy of bloodletting to send a message to Mehmed. In a letter to the Hungarian king, Dracula bragged that he had massacred over 23,000 Turks and Bulgars, boasting of the body count down to the last man. To impress the king with his accuracy, Dracula also, quote, counted the heads, noses, and ears cut off his victims. This assault enraged Mehmed II, as you could imagine, who retaliated by assembling a massive army of over 100,000 soldiers. In the spring of 1462, the Sultan's forces crossed the Danube, accompanied by Dracula's younger brother, Radu, and other Wallachian nobles who supported Ottoman rule. This is fascinating now. Dracula and his brother were in the same Ottoman jail together. Dracula went home to retake his family's throne, and Radu stayed with the Ottomans. Now the two brothers are on opposite sides of a battlefield. Dracula was badly outnumbered, only having an estimated 40,000 troops at his side. With the odds against him, Dracula faced this onslaught by employing every trick he could to even the scales. Much like Napoleon, the impaling prince had a knack for inspiring enthusiasm in his men. He brought out a fighting spirit amongst the Wallachian peasants, whose morale was extremely high, knowing that they were defending their homeland, with a ruler who they believed was finally fighting for them. As the Ottomans marched towards Wallachia, Dracula orchestrated a ruthless, scorched earth approach. His troops poisoned wells, burned crops, evacuated villages, and left nothing of value for his enemies to seize. In a military campaign in the 1400s, this made resupplying their men nearly impossible. And in what was truly a groundbreaking strategy, he employed a very early example of biological warfare. One account states Dracula deliberately sent individuals infected with leprosy, tuberculosis, syphilis, and the bubonic plague into Ottoman camps, disguising them as Turks so they would spread illness amongst the enemy ranks. As a result, the Wallachians were able to slow down the Ottoman army as it marched toward the capital city of Targovista. The tactics of attrition employed by Dracula were not incidental or newfound. He knew they would work because he was drawing from his childhood experience under Ottoman captivity, observing the Turks' military strategy. Now, not only were the Turkish army resources diminished, but so was their morale, both against the officers and the Sultan himself. Recognizing defeat was all but inevitable, the Sultan eventually made the decision to withdraw. But this wasn't enough for Dracula. He didn't just want them to leave, he wanted them dead. So Dracula didn't let up. He planned more direct attacks, and in June of 1462, led a nighttime raid straight into the heart of the Ottoman camp. Here, he intended to assassinate Mehmed II himself, throwing their empire into chaos. With a small elite force by his side under the cover of darkness, Dracula and his men disguised themselves in Turkish uniforms and successfully infiltrated the enemy encampment. In what is now known as the Night Attack, unique name, Dracula's men set fires, cut down Ottoman soldiers, and pressed towards the Sultan's tent. Some estimates say over 15,000 Ottoman soldiers were killed in this nighttime siege. In the middle of the onslaught, Dracula approached Mehmed's tent to carry out the assassination he had been planning for years. But in the darkness and the confusion, Dracula had identified the wrong tent and was eventually forced to retreat. Although the attempt on the Sultan's life had failed, the raid shook the Ottomans, and it served another tactical purpose. Mehmed's forces were drawn back into Wallachian territory in retaliation. But when they finally reached the capital, the Sultan's army found it deserted. Dracula had pulled his remaining troops out of the city. What the Ottomans saw instead was one of the most gruesome spectacles recorded in medieval history. Outside the city, stretched out for nearly a mile, was the, quote, Forest of the Impaled. Thousands of stakes at various heights fashioned like a picket fence. On each of these stakes were the remaining carcasses of around 20,000 Turkish soldiers, their bodies completely decomposed from the summer heat and scavenging birds. Many of the birds had made their nest in the skulls and skeletal remains of the victims. Which it's no wonder, amongst all of the players in medieval history at this time, that Dracula's the one we remember. I mean, could you even imagine that? 20,000 rotting corpses, each precariously put on a stake, just to terrify the invading army as they approach a capital city that you have left deserted? That is absolutely terrifying. And rightfully so, the Sultan was horrified. A battle-hardened warrior who reportedly asked in dismay, quote, What can we do against a man who commits such deeds? His army, already weakened by disease, supply shortages, and the potential prospect of a long war, lost their appetite for further pursuit, as you could imagine. I mean, this guy put 20,000 of your boys up on wooden stakes. I do not want to keep fighting him. Shortly after, Mehmed gave the orders for a full retreat. In his eyes, Wallachia was not worth the price of victory. And at last, Dracula had stopped the Ottoman advance. Amongst his fellow countrymen and all across the Balkans, word of Dracula's victory over the Ottomans was celebrated. The brutally violent prince was credited with saving Wallachia from certain conquest. Contemporary Christian leaders, even Pope Pius II, would praise Dracula for his resistance to the Ottomans, calling him a crusader who had answered the call to defend Europe when few others would. And in Romanian history, the night attack of 1462 continues to be celebrated as a monumental act of national heroism. A smaller force striking fear into a superior foe through sheer boldness, brutality, and cunning. But for all the praise and celebration that would eventually come his way, Dracula's reign, much like the stakes used to impale his victims, would find itself at a sharp end. Dracula's triumph over Mehmed's 1462 invasion was short-lived. Despite the Ottomans withdrawing their assault, Wallachia found itself in ruin, ravaged by war and plague. Its fields burned, and its population was terrorized and exhausted. Which, yeah, I wonder whose fault that was. Many Wallachian nobles, tired of Dracula's brutality, defected to Radu's side, who remained in the country with Ottoman backing and claimed the position of prince. Radu would eventually die between 1475 and 1477, likely from assassination or execution at the hands of his political rival, Stephen III of Moldavia. Facing shrinking support at home and unable to continue the fight, Dracula retreated toward the Carpathians. He sought help from his ally, King Matthias of Hungary. However, the Hungarian king had his own political troubles and viewed the removal of Dracula from power as an advantage. When Dracula finally crossed into Transylvania, Matthias betrayed him and arrested Dracula in the winter of 1462. It seems that spending your time in charge by killing outsiders and other rulers doesn't work so well when you're seeking aid from an outsider who is a ruler. But despite this, Matthias had some explaining to do. The arrest came mere months after Dracula had been universally deemed a hero against Mehmed, especially amongst the European powers in Venice and Rome. An overwhelming amount of resources had been spent in the name of crusading and defending the Christian realms, and Dracula was able to do his with only a small army and genius warfare tactics. So naturally, he lost favor amongst people who also wanted the Ottomans out. To justify Matthias's drastic action, the Hungarian court circulated letters allegedly written by Dracula that showed he had been bargaining with the Ottomans and thus painted him as a traitor. Historians believe these letters were forged due to the handwriting and style, the rhetoric of meek submission, which was the polar opposite of Dracula's character, as well as the clumsy wording and poor Latin. Also, given everything we know about Dracula, highly doubt he had anything to do with an Ottoman. I doubt he wanted to have a conversation with one. Nevertheless, Dracula spent a dozen years in captivity in Hungary from 1463 to 1475. Very little is known of this imprisonment, aside from the fact that he was mostly kept, quote, under house arrest as a distinguished prisoner. Tales of his time there suggest he was never fully tamed, as one anecdote claimed he amused himself by catching mice and impaling them on tiny sticks. So, I'm sure he was just doing it for the political well-being of his people. Guys, that's why he continued to do it to rats. Clearly, these rats are enemies of the state. This would later be confirmed by a bishop who wrote that Dracula, quote, was unable to forget his wickedness and stuck the mice on small pieces of wood, just as he had stuck men on stakes. Goes to show you, kids, you can take the impaler out of Wallachia, but you can't take the Wallachia out of the impaler. Over the years, King Matthias realized Dracula might be useful. In the mid-1470s, the Ottoman threat to Hungary had grown once again, and Wallachia saw instability by a succession of weak rulers. Many Wallachian nobles and neighboring princes urged for Dracula's reinstatement to the throne, preferring the devil they knew over continued anarchy. And they didn't want the Ottomans in charge, so maybe put the guy back into power who's really good at killing Ottomans. In 1476, Matthias released Dracula and provided him with a small army to reclaim Wallachia once more. By November, Dracula succeeded in taking back the throne for a third time. This reign, however, would be his shortest. Within weeks of regaining control, Dracula was ambushed and killed. The most widely accepted account is that a hired assassin from the Turkish camp disguised himself as a servant and stabbed Dracula from behind. an ironic end to the Impaler's life. The assassin then cut off Dracula's head and brought it back to the Sultan, who had it displayed on a stake in Constantinople. It was a public trophy to reassure the Ottoman people that their dreaded enemy was no more. And also, again, poetically, his head was placed on a stake. Dracula's torso was reportedly recovered by monks and buried at an island monastery in Snagov, which is located north of Bucharest. Again, considering Dracula had gained favor among church leaders for keeping the Ottomans out. There is much mystery surrounding his grave. When his tomb at Snagov was opened centuries later, it only contained, quote, the bones of various animals, some ceramics, and other archaeological finds. So potentially, at some point, someone stole his body and just left other stuff in there. Or he was never buried there in the first place, or when this guy died, he just turned to like animal bones and plates. However, the uncertainty of Dracula's final resting place gave rise to rumors. According to folk legend, the Impaler could not peacefully lie on earth, perhaps even rising from his grave. Let's look at that. Stakes, drinking blood, rising from coffins. We got the whole trifecta. Dracula's death and the subsequent disappearance of his body fed the legendary tales that he was undead, his restless corpse an eerie foreshadowing of the vampire folklore to follow. Dracula's unprecedented brutality and cruel methods of punishment made him infamous beyond Walachia's borders while he was still alive. When news of his death in 1476 spread across Europe, his reputation morphed into macabre legend. The invention of the printing press helped expand lurid stories of his atrocities, which later became some of the first mass-produced bestsellers in Europe. In the late 1400s, a series of pamphlets about Dracula spread to German-speaking territories, Italy, and abroad, which cemented his image as one of the world's most bloodthirsty tyrants. One pamphlet from 1499 in Nuremberg, for instance, contained the famous woodcut of Dracula seated amongst the impaled heads. Not a single known detail of Dracula's cruel acts were emitted from these publications, and his sadistic punishments made for an endless catalog of terror. These reports were almost certainly exaggerated and one-sided due to the fact that many were written by Saxon refugees from Transylvania or Catholic monks who were targets of Dracula for not paying his tolls. German-speaking merchants who suffered under Dracula's trade restrictions and brutal reprisals included stories in their pamphlets that often embellished their misfortunes and besmirched Dracula's reputation in order to shock readers, which, granted, wasn't that hard to do. And at its core, Dracula's image of a monstrously cruel prince was based on real events, and even the craziest stories had parallels in Wallachian or Russian sources. In fact, Russia's Ivan the Terrible drew upon Dracula's terror as a political model. Today, historians note that there is a remarkable coincidence between the German, Russian, and Romanian stories of Dracula, despite differences in tone, and they recount many of the same incidents. Even if the specifics of the narratives were colored by bias, Dracula's cruelty was well-founded in reality. While Western Europe was thrilled with morbid fascination at his horror, the people in Dracula's homeland took a more nuanced view. There was a duality to his legacy, a villainous monster who brutally tortured his victims, and a folk hero whose harsh reign brought stability and independence to Wallachia. Amongst the Romanians, Dracula remained a complex figure, but one often cast in a nationalistic, positive light. This is due to the fact that, quote, almost no rulers in European Christendom were prepared to fight their greatest political and religious enemies, the Muslim Turks. But Dracula did so, single-handedly outnumbered 4-1. His valiant defense of Wallachia gave him the reputation as the, quote, savior of Romanian Christendom in folklore. Romanian poems over centuries often tended to rationalize and justify his violence as a necessity for justice. In these readings, Dracula's cruelty is aimed at thieves, corrupt nobles, and outside enemies, essentially all those who deserved it. More broadly speaking, Dracula became an almost mythical figure that symbolized stern justice and resistance, a leader who, through extreme measures, kept the nation safe when surrounded by mighty foes. So sure, the people that didn't get invaded by the Ottomans liked him, and pretty much everyone else was terrified of him, as you can imagine. Ironically, the fame of Dracula would reach its broadest audience not through history books, but through a work of fiction published over 4 centuries after his death. The name Dracula might have remained little more than a historical footnote in Eastern European libraries, if not for Bram Stoker, who, in 1897, unleashed his novel Dracula upon the world. The book tells a story about an undead Transylvanian count, a vampire, who travels to England to prey upon the living. Stoker did not intentionally set out to link his villain with Vlad the Impaler. Early iterations show the author calling his vampire protagonist Count Vampire. But during the research, Stoker came across a book about the history of Walachia and Moldavia that mentioned Dracula and, crucially, translated the name as meaning devil in the Wallachian tongue. This resonated with Stoker, who decided it was the perfect name for his villain. I mean, Dracula means son of the devil. Can't get much better than that. Thus, Count Vampire became Count Dracula, forever connecting the fictional vampire with the real Wallachian prince. Aside from minor things like the bit about wooden stakes and a post-dinner sabotage and drinking the blood of your enemies and him potentially rising from the grave, this is where the connection basically ends. Stoker was more interested in creating a novel of supernatural horror, drawing on multiple other inspirations for his monster, with Vlad the Impaler serving as a fairly minor one. Stoker, for example, transplanted his count to Transylvania due to the fact it seemed more mysterious to Victorian readers. As for the name itself, Stoker borrowed Dracula, most likely due to its demonic connotation, so it could lend his character exotic menace. Also, the vampire count was a shape-shifting undead aristocrat rather than a mortal prince. However, despite not incorporating Dracula's actual deeds of the 15th century context into the plot, Stoker included a small reference in the novel that Count Dracula fought the Turks, a subtle nod to the historical prince, one I'm sure most readers of the time probably didn't pick up on. As for the whole garlic thing, well, that started with Stoker, who included garlic flowers in his book to repel Count Dracula. It probably began in ancient folklore, though, as garlic's antibiotic properties were believed to counter vampirism, which was considered a disease of the blood. Stoker also invented the trope of vampires having no reflection, seeing as they lack souls. Also, silver was considered a pure substance, and since vampires were demonic or evil spirits in nature, they couldn't come into contact with it. And mirrors at the time were most often made of reflective silver, which is why they weren't able to see their image in a pure substance. And they're afraid of crucifixes and the cross because, you know, demonic and whatnot. And although Slavic lore believed that a bat flying over a corpse would cause it to turn into a vampire, Stoker's novel solidified the association by depicting Count Dracula as a shapeshifter who could take the form of a bat. As for the rule of vampires needing an invitation to enter a private home, well, that's founded in folklore predating Stoker's work, as is a vampire's aversion to the cross. In the 20th century, modern-day fascination over the connection between this historical fact and horrifying fiction prevailed. Works such as 1972's In Search of Dracula, written by Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally, which are often cited here in this video, promoted a connection between Vlad the Impaler and Dracula, popularizing the former's grisly biography in the West. The notion that the basis for a character as evil as Stoker's vampire had been inspired by a real medieval tyrant was too irresistible to the public. Today, the truth is evidenced by Dracula's worldwide fame as both historical figure and legendary vampire. It's also fascinating that the idea of Vlad Dracula helped make Count Dracula famous, and years later, Vlad Dracula became more famous because of the association with Count Dracula that was already famous. Over half a century after his violent death, the real Dracula continues to fascinate and appall us in equal measure. He is a reflection, get it, reflection, vampire, he's a reflection of medieval power. His story of ferocity, war, and dark statecraft pushed the boundaries of moral terror. From his troubled youth as a hostage to his bloody rise and fall to the legends spread by his enemies, Dracula's deeds carved out an undeniable mark in history. And through the magic of storytelling, with his name given immortality in the pages of Bram Stoker's Dracula, the name has achieved everlasting notoriety that would have been impossible to imagine in the 14th century. In the end, the Impaler Prince of Wallachia is a reminder that sometimes reality can rival the worst of nightmares. And human history often inspires the most enduring mythological horror. Just as it is with Count Dracula himself, Dracula's legacy will never die. And what else will never die is my appreciation for you guys sticking around to the end of this video, and I just want to say Thank you for watching. It's universally agreed upon that Dracula did evil things, but it's fascinating how his people saw him as a good ruler, and like the Christian kingships at the time did as well, because he got results, he got things done. And it's funny how despite the tone, both his enemies and allies would describe the same horrific events, just from different perspectives. It's an interesting story, and very interesting how it inspired one of the most famous characters from literature. Now, I'm glad I got to talk about it today, and I appreciate you guys sticking around. We should have one or two more scary videos on this channel before Halloween. Thank you all so much for the support you've been showing us thus far. It really does mean a lot to see this channel succeed so quickly. Of course, thank you for the support on Wendigoon and Creepcast. You guys are a blessing no matter where you show up. Everyone who made this video possible will be linked in the description. Be sure to show them some love. I guarantee you I could not do this without them. Over here, I'm just the face that says stuff. They deserve all the credit. So be sure to show them some appreciation in the comments below, as we certainly appreciate you guys. I believe that should do it for now, but before I go, we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye! And if you think about it, Vlad the Impaler also wore those really stupid coats and cloaks. That's probably where they got that for Dracula, too. He might have had sharp teeth, too. Wonder if anyone checked.